I'm just going to check real fast to see if is it playing? Okay, it's playing. All right. On November 7th, the year 2000, the now famous election between Bush versus Gore occurred. Now, we all know this election was actually very close, and it caused necessary recounts, namely in the state of Florida. So actually 3 recounts occurred, and Bush's lead per hour shrunk from around 100 votes to about 200. So because the nation needed a new president, and this had already been about a few weeks now, the Supreme Court actually blocked the state of Florida from conducting a 4th recount, which at this point, these recounts have become manual. And so Bush actually officially won the election. Al Gore obviously didn't like this result, and so he actually sued George W. Bush, and this was appealed to the Supreme Court, but of course Bush won the case, and the Supreme Court blocked or just really ended the case in Bush's favor, and so he won the election. So this normal presidential election actually became a matter of public dispute, and then eventually it became a judicial matter. So 9 years before this, federal judge Clarence Thomas was nominated by George H.W. Bush, who was, the father of George W. Bush, and this was for Associate Justice for the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the difference between this and previous nominations was that although the president nominates an Associate Justice, the Senate actually has to confirm these justices. And this was the first judicial confirmation where the Senate actually publicized the confirmation, and it was on TV, it was on CTV. And so this became a public matter, whereas before it was just a totally private government function. Now, what this also was a landmark case, or why it was a landmark case, was because this judicial confirmation was actually really political. It was super political, because certain groups of senators did not like Clarence Thomas just because of his political beliefs or his associations in the past and potentially his race. So this became a political fiasco, and it actually stooped so low as to come to a point where a woman named Anita Hill was brought to the table, or brought to the confirmation, and she accused Clarence Thomas of sexually molesting her. But eventually these claims were found to have not enough proof, or at least it was only circumstantial evidence. And so Clarence Thomas was brought into the Supreme Court, and he remains a justice to this day. Now, 2 years before this, in 1989, a man named Jim Jeffords was elected as a representative for the state of Vermont, and he was elected as a Republican. However, in 2001, midterm, he decided on his own, independently, that he would switch party affiliation from Republican to Democrat. So he started caucusing with Democrats instead of Republican. However, this was midterm, so what Jeffords did was he broke cardinal rule of being representative, and he didn't actually represent his district. So what these 3 instances share in common, even though they happened over about 11 years, is that all 3 of these are examples of how the selection systems in their respective branches have been broken or distorted in some way. So my name is Kenneth Sanders, and today I'm going to tell you why and how America's selection systems are broken. However, before I can actually bring you to my main 3 points, I do need to limit the argument just to make it small enough so that it's not so broad that we can't actually discuss it. So my first limitation is that I'll only be discussing federal elections and federal, appointments. So state and local appointments and elections would be far too much to cover. And also federal election appointments are universal across the country. So I may not know about something in San Francisco because no one in San Francisco has jurisdiction over me. But George W. Bush had jurisdiction over the entire country. And so because it's more well known, it's easier to talk about federal elections. Secondly, I'll not be fighting a solution because there's so many solutions to these different problems, and just talking about the problem itself is such a broad topic that would be far too much time. So that's why I'm not talking about solutions or solvency. As a side note, I'll also not be talking about funding. It's part of a solution, But because obtaining funding is such a difficult and important part of any government function, I wanted to point this out in particular. So I'm not going to be discussing funding in this analysis. Finally, I'll only be discussing U.S. history and U.S. government, because I do understand that the founding fathers of this nation had outside influences. Obviously, they did. But they created a nation that's one of a kind, and the U.S. is too unique for other countries to really matter in this really specific topic and argument that really only matters for the U.S. So I also need to provide some context. So this context will be spanning entire U.S. history, and my frame of reference will be World War II. So there will be two eras here: pre-World War II, post-World War II. And this is because this time that World War II took place in fundamentally changed people's perception of the role of government and how big government should be and how involved it should be in daily life. So whereas in the 19th century, there was IRS or Department of Agriculture, and the Constitution speaks of nothing of the sort. After World War II, these agencies that FDR created in order to provide more jobs and just help the general American economy, they just stuck around. And so what happened was people changed how they thought about government in general. So to talk about pre-World War II, in the beginning of America, technically this was a kind of proto-America. We're under the law of the Articles of Confederation. So this was our first official form of government after the Revolution. However, the Articles had a major problem in that they couldn't actually enforce the law that they, that was written down in them. So what this practically meant was that there were no federal taxes that could be levied from citizens. So the Articles couldn't force taxes to be collected. So the federal government couldn't really function just because it didn't have any money. And also no national military could be created from different states. So the states had their own militaries. And what this did was each was effectively just its own nation, and the United States were just states. So this was a big issue. So the founding fathers actually wrote the Constitution, which was a slightly bigger form of government that would allow the federal government to function and also provide freedom to the state governments and then the people within each state. Now, the Constitution was the first example of a jump in the size of American government. And since then, America has not actually shrunk the size of government. We've continually had a slow growth, and that growth was greatly accelerated by FDR and his presidency during the Great Depression. So talking about post-World War II, a caveat here is that although the Great Depression and most of FDR's presidency were before World War II, what they did was they affected post-World War II, not really pre-World War II. So I'm including the Great Depression, FDR's presidency, and World War II in the post era. So what FDR did was, because of the Great Depression, he felt like he had to create a bunch of government functions and agencies and programs to help American citizens get jobs back. And so what FDR did was he made it look like government was better at creating jobs and making life better than a normal free market. And so what that did was it made big government look more appealing to the American people, and it changed the public's view of the role of government and what government should look like and what it should be. So this brings me to my three main points for today. First, the current selection systems are outdated. Second, that the purpose of the three branches and the relationship between the three branches has been distorted, it's been warped. And finally, that current selection processes overly politicize all government processes. So to talk about the fact that current systems are outdated, well, what I mean by this is not that the Constitution is an outdated document. No, it's really the most important American document or document in American history. What I really mean is that edits made to the Constitution or expansions outside of the Constitution in legislation have made these systems outdated and really made them obsolete. So an example of the judicial confirmations on TV, like we see with Clarence Thomas, and really actually every other judicial confirmation after Clarence Thomas. another example would be the 17th Amendment, which made voting for senators actually a direct line vote, which is a popular vote rather than a selection by state representatives. So what this did was it really destroyed each state's voice in the federal government. And senators, it's more of a popularity contest than it ever was before. And so this really destroyed the point of having senators in the first place. And so over time, all of these different edits to the Constitution have really tainted the spirit of politics and made it more about bureaucracy and making government bigger and more involved in people's lives than it was before. And so this creates things like career politicians, which is kind of like the tax service. It's just so overly complicated at this point that you have to make it your career to even understand it. And the Constitution was pretty simple on purpose. I mean, the normal person, if you can read the Constitution in maybe half an hour. It's a really simple document relative to other government documents, but that's been tainted over time, and that's the issue. Moving on, modern culture and population is wildly different from, obviously, what it was before, like when the Constitution was originally written. But it also is wildly different from even 50 years ago. So, America as a nation has exploded in size in every way. We've become a world superpower, have a huge population, a booming economy, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens is when legislators make bad legislation and they don't have forethought, it comes back and it really, it's shooting people in the foot. So without forethought, you have unforeseen consequences. And one of those consequences is that people don't really want to participate in the political process. And even more so, people who want to participate can't because just bad legislation. So an example of this would be decreased voting accessibility just for the presidential vote. So in the past 20 years, over half of the states in the union have made voting more difficult. So this would be either to decrease the window that you can vote in, or that you can have advanced voting, to decrease the amount of places that you can vote at, so that this makes it more crowded and more difficult and more time consuming. And also it makes it more difficult, or some states have passed laws making it more difficult to register to vote. So what this does is it discourages voting. And so less people vote, and the political process is affected in a negative way. So this bad legislation has tainted what the Constitution had originally dictated. So an argument against this is that although old things can sometimes be bad, so old institutions with bad forethought can have negative consequences, it's not always bad, and a lot of things can be timeless. So an example would be Electoral College. So the Electoral College was created because America had an uneven population distribution. And as we all know, America still has an uneven population distribution. So when, in the days of the Electoral College and its inception, this would be states like Virginia or New York versus or Rhode Island. But nowadays it's more like California and Texas versus states like North and South Dakota or Wyoming. I mean, these have really small populations. And so the Electoral College allows for them to still have a voice in the presidential election. However, my response to this would be that even though the Electoral College is a fantastic idea, it does debatably give a little bit too much of a voice for states with maybe 600,000 people, or other states have a really muted voice and they have 30 million people. That doesn't, we're not a democratic country. At the same time, we do need to represent the needs, wants of the nation as a whole. And so that's become an issue. And as different voting laws, especially, are passed, younger Americans, especially younger Americans, versus older Americans are less interested in participating. Voting is less important, it's considered as less important, and it's seen as more difficult than it ever has been before. So my second point today, the branch's purpose has been distorted. Each branch is what I'm saying. Each branch acts differently and has a different agenda. And every branch is willing to just totally surrender one power if they can trade it for another power or for some kind of perk. Actually, sometimes, though, it's just bad legislation, like I was saying earlier, and it's just passed with poor forethought. So an example of this would be the War Power Act of 1973, passed by Congress. So Congress at the point was trying to bring back or get back its constitutional right to declare war. The president doesn't have a right to do this only by constitution. So what this did was it gave the president 60 days to have an unofficial conflict and to end it. After the 60 days, Congress could take back the troops. But what this actually did was it totally relinquished Congress's power to declare or to conduct war or to say no to a war, because in reality, after 60 days of continued fighting, no person in Congress is going to suggest that the 20 guys who died over in Vietnam should just die in vain and bring back all the troops. So then what actually happens, the president who wants to, have a war in Vietnam can just throw troops over, and he knows that no one's going to pull him back. So another example for the executive branch would be the executive orders. So the president is in power continually since the birth of the nation. But I'm going to talk about executive orders in a little bit. So finally, the judicial branch is supposed to be apolitical, really it's become an extension of the legislative branch. And what they've done, what they've really gotten in this trade is that all judicial officials have a lifetime job, or at least all people in the Supreme Court. So associate justices and the justice have total lifetime job security, and they also have the power to choose what legislation is going to be passed or how to win a court case, different civil disputes, and important debates. So an example of this would be Obergefell versus Hodges in 2016. The Supreme Court had total rule over that, and it was just 9 people who got to choose for a whole nation whether or not it would be legal or not. So to talk about executive orders more, just to list some constitutional powers of the president has the right to nominate certain officials, as we saw with Clarence Thomas and all other justices. He has the power to pardon different people for any crime. So we've seen Trump pardon a lot of people for just different crimes that he didn't believe were fair. He actually pardoned William Barr as well, and Obama during his presidency pardoned a lot of people as well. Finally, of course, the president also commander-in-chief of the military. And so, although he cannot declare war constitutionally, he, he does have the right to determine what goes on with the military. However, he cannot actually declare the war. But what's happened over time is that the president will just put troops wherever he wants, and he knows that no one is going to pull the troops back. So the last official war that the U.S. was involved in, or that the U.S. declared war on another nation, was World War II. That ended in 1945. Since then, presidents have involved us in 14 different conflicts, such as the Vietnam conflict, the Korea conflict, or even the war on terrorism, which is just all around the Middle East. And what this has done is it's given the president kind of kingly powers over the 4 to 8 years that he's in office. And the issue with this is that the public and different policies that have been passed in the past years have been in agreement with this. And so the president has just been allowed to increase in power continually since the birth of the nation. And people are okay with that, and people want it. And that's just a really big issue. So a refutation to this, or an opposing argument, would be that although the different branches, the 3 branches, have traded a lot of power, they're still overall balanced. So they may have traded different powers, but the relationship between them is still overall equal, and they still check each other out. So an example would be that the president, even though he has kingly powers, he only has kingly powers for 4 or 8 years. FDR was an exception, but now, obviously, the president only has terms. You have term limits for that. And an example would be that although Supreme Court justices have lifetime job security, they have to be nominated by the president from the executive branch, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate, which is in the legislative branch. So the Supreme Court has total dependence over the other 2 branches. However, the issue with this is that even if powers were equal. We live under an almost totally uncompromising government, and especially in Congress, party divisions and polarization between beliefs makes any two people who are political opponents of each other, it's really difficult to compromise because you come from almost opposite worldviews or stances. And so almost everything has become this partisan thing where everything is about which party you believe politically, and legislation looks more like a worldview tug of war than an actual compromise and trying to represent the wants of your constituents. My final point today is that the current selection systems overly politicize all government functions. And an important, really key note to make here is that government does not mean politics. So you can have government and have zero politics. However, what happens is as government increases in size, politics really admittedly does become necessary to some degree, but people have taken this too far. Politics should not be encouraged, and politics should not be brought up in conversations where it doesn't naturally arise or bring itself up. However, despite this, I think pretty obvious fact, Americans encourage this continued politicization because the other side becomes a kind of bad guy. An example of this would be Colin Kaepernick, who's an NFL player who decided to protest against what he believed was the racism of our official national anthem. And his simple protest, where he took one knee, became a global political debate, or even the president was pitching in. And, when you manage to make football political, there's how current selection systems have been overly politicized, is that voting has been abused, really. And what happens is people have been voting for a long time more against the other party than they have been voting for their party. So people I've seen have been tend to vote for the lesser of two evils than for a candidate that they actually think can make the country better or can preserve our rights or whatever they believe is the most important thing that a president or any other official should be for. So as this increase in party division is in between, our two main parties, the Democrat and Republican Party, now personally people hold to their beliefs. Politics spreads into every facet and every corner of people's lives. And you get to a point what I call political tribalism. And so your tribe or the Democrat tribe is fighting against the Republican tribe, and anything that the Republican tribe does is bad. Everything that the Democrat tribe does is good. And so people end up sorting themselves into these think-alike communities. And so every part of their life is with people who believe the same as they do, who look the same as they do, the same as they do. And so it becomes a bubble of light. And really both sides of guilty of this. However, there is an opposing view, and what it is that actually politicization is good, and it does make government more fair because of two reasons. So first, it allows for more discussion, more compromise in government. And second, that since all officials in government actually do at this point work to push their agenda, they should be known so that the public can understand what these agendas are going to be pushed, because inevitably somebody has a political agenda and they're going to work to push it and work to bring about the world that they want to bring about. And this source was specifically talking about judicial confirmations, which was actually an apolitical branch of government. But so my response to this is that refutation makes a false assumption that politics is good for government. As I said before, politics is sometimes necessary, and I get that. But the issue with it is that the more you use politics, the further you get from a fair government, fair governance. And like I was saying before, judicial officials are intentionally supposed to be appointed apolitically or without politics. So the judicial branch is supposed to, with no politics involved whatsoever, objectively look at the Constitution and interpret it and apply it to whatever situation happens to be, arisen. So this spread of politics is not good for government. And assuming that it is really, I think, dangerous to a fair government. Now, today, this analysis has shown that from the 2000 election between Bush v. Gore, between Jim Jeffords and his decision to not represent his district, and Clarence Thomas, and how his judicial confirmation accidentally became a political and nationwide fiasco. Something is wrong with the selection systems in America. The first point today is that they're outdated, that they become outdated because of old and even new legislation passed outside of the Constitution. More that the three branches have lost their purpose and that the relationship between them has been broken. And lastly, the selection system really politicized everything. I'd like to leave you with a quote by one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, who said that a true patriot will defend his government against, a true patriot will defend his country from its government. Thank you. I don't know if I'm, okay, there.
See if I can get to gallery view. Can you hear me, Kenny?
Yep. Yeah, you're unmuted.
Okay. Dude, great job. Perhaps more than any other I have seen this year, and maybe even in past years, I think what you did represents the true spirit of rhetoric insofar as you made your point, but I think you really did a really neat job of giving validity to the opposing view. This is kind of an interesting exercise that you pursued. As, you know, we've had this discussion before because there's two pretty valid sides to this argument. And I thought you did a very credible job of presenting kind of the other side, that just because you advocate this position, there are others who have a valid argument as well. And I also think that you made your point came across strongly that what we're doing is not what was intentional. Mm-hmm. And I think this career politician avenue that you referred to, is there a way we get around career politicians? I'm not sure term limits are the answer, because we have term limits for some people and we still have career politicians. Mm-hmm. You know, so what do we do?
I think that the main ways to prevent something like career politicians, if you're going for prevention of career politicians, would be for term limits for everyone. Because, you know, people like senators don't have term limits, and they'll end up being senators for Jim Jeffords, for example, was a senator for 16 years straight. And so if you exact term limits on every official, then that can prevent it. But realistically, with the size of our government now, I'm not really sure if career politicians are an avoidable thing. I think that they're just a reality that we have to live with, unless we want to shrink our government back down, which I don't know if that's really that possible at this point.
Yeah, and the other danger is if you have term limits, you get rid of the good ones too.
Yeah, you get rid of everybody.
Yeah. So, but yeah, really, really good job. Yours is a very, very intriguing thesis endeavor for me. I really was fascinated by it, and you have the chops to pull this off. Your paper is excellent. Saying you're speaking, you really brought home the point. It's structured very well. Good job.
Thank you.
And Kenneth, this is Ms. Knight. I don't actually have a question for you either, but I just want to affirm you with you're very well spoken and excellent grasp of this material, and you presented it very well. And so I don't know what your future life plan is, but look into the law. Here's my plug.
Thank you.
I think you did an outstanding job. It's been a pleasure to watch your points of development as you've turned those in to me, and I have thoroughly enjoyed being a very tiny part of this process so that I could see how you work. Having not had the senior class in class, it's been a real pleasure just to watch you grow. So thank you, Kenny. It's been great. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Let me throw my 2 cents in there. Kenny did an excellent job. I agree with Mr. Lawrence. You presented both sides of the argument well, and even to the point of where you almost endorsed the refutation because you presented it that well. My question is, I know you're not saying we need to redo the Constitution because you made that in your first point, but do you see that this as a situation that's going to continue just to get worse and worse and worse to the point of maybe our government falling apart? Or do you think there's hope that it will kind of self-correct or something like that?
Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. I think that this will end either with something that might be some kind of like violent revolution if people wake up, or government might just continue expanding. Or a third option, which is kind of what I would be hoping for, would be a kind of cultural revolution, and that people could change their minds without, any kind of violence, and that we could bring government back to what I believe it should be. But I'm not, I don't really know. This has been going on for a long time, so I don't know how long it'll keep on going on.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it seems to have escalated just in the last 20 to 30 years compared to what it used to be, as you pointed out, the post-World War II thing. So, and a little revolution from time to time is a good thing. Good job, Kenny. Thank you.
Indeed.
I have another question for you. You know what I've always, one of my favorite arguments, it's always about the money.
Yeah, usually.
Yeah. Is this whole issue, is it tied to power or money or both, or what? I mean, how did we get here?
I think that we have three branches, and it looks like every branch has been searching for a different little thing. So Congress has control over how much they get paid, basically. And so they've been slowly increasing their pay and trying to get to a point where they can really just get paid to do almost nothing. And the president has, presidents over time have been trying to just take a little bit of power away from the judicial branch or the legislative branch. And so it looks like presidents have been vying for control, although, the president gets paid much more than he did in the past. Especially recently, our presidents are pretty wealthy, so I don't think that they really care about, especially with Trump. I mean, he's fine. He hasn't even been taking his, presidential salary. And so he's just been, it looks more like he cares more about the power aspect than the wealth, because he already had the wealth. So that's kind of all you have left to get in the world. And I'm not really sure what the, namely really the Supreme Court, but it looks like they just seem to just want security and just be judges for the rest of their life. Because I think since they're lawyers, they may be more interested in just an intellectual pursuit and just security to live your life. And so it looks like each branch has been looking for something a little bit different. But in the end, it does look like it's more just like it always is. It's usually wealth or power or control over the people.
Good observations. Yeah. Annie, I know you had some angst about this because it's a lot different than, it's hard. Well, it's just a lot different than what we anticipated. Yeah. Rest assured, you handled this extremely well.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, you got it. So right. I'm impressed, dude. Good job. If nobody else has anything, we shall call it a day. Is this the last? This is it. So you can take your suit off and you can be a kid again for a while.
Congratulations, Kenneth.
Good job, bud.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you guys later.
All right. Have a good one.